They never told you this part of history. Because if you knew it, you would understand just how far an empire will go to control not only land, but flesh, blood, and the very soul of a man. Picture this, a quiet village at the edge of ancient Persia. Mothers clutching their sons as the sound of hooves shatters the silence. Imperial agents march through the narrow streets, eyes scanning, calculating, selecting. And when their gaze lands on a boy, barely a teenager, the family knows. His life is already over. He will not grow into a man. He will be transformed into something else entirely, a eunuch. This was not whispered mythology. It was state policy. A cold, deliberate system designed to carve obedience into the body itself. The castration ritual was no accident of culture, it was the empire's most ruthless experiment in control. No sons to carry their name, no wives to build alliances, no chance of rebellion that could birth a dynasty. A eunuch was the perfect servant, loyal, because he had nowhere else to go, broken, because his future was ripped from him before it could even begin. The process was agony. Imagine it, no anesthesia, no mercy. A boy held down, his screams echoing into the night as his body was mutilated with crude blades. Some bled out on the spot, dying in the dirt as offerings to empire's hunger. Those who lived carried the scar forever, not just on their bodies but deep in their spirit. It was not only flesh that was severed, it was destiny. A forced passage into a liminal existence, no longer son, no longer man, but property. And yet, the cruelty did not end there. These broken boys were dragged to the palace, where golden halls and polished marble masked a system of absolute domination. Inside those walls, the eunuch was both elevated and degraded. He could stand closer to the king than most generals, yet he could never truly stand tall. He guarded harems, carried secrets, whispered advice in the ears of rulers, but every privilege was poisoned by the reminder of what had been stolen from him. He was a tool, a weapon shaped by suffering, and a living reminder of the empire's power to bend human nature to its will. You see, the Persian eunuch was not just a servant of the court. He was a living symbol, proof that the state could take a boy and remake him into something unnatural, something in between, something forever chained. And the lesson buried in this horror? That power, at its core, is not about ruling men. It is about reshaping them. Inside the Persian Empire, eunuchs were not accidents of cruelty. They were blueprints of strategy. Every scar carved into their bodies was a signature of imperial design, a reminder that the king's control extended past armies and into the marrow of men. They were engineered to be loyal, because loyalty born of choice can falter, but loyalty born of mutilation, that is unbreakable. Think about it. A eunuch had no bloodline, no heirs, no dynasty to protect or to rebel for. His survival depended solely on the favor of the crown. And that is why kings trusted them more than generals, more than ministers, more than any blood relative. Blood betrays. Ambition schemes. But a eunuch? His future was already stolen. He had no path but obedience. That is how the empire built its walls of trust, not with stone, but with the suffering of boys. But there was another layer, one that history buries under marble ruins and sanitized stories. Eunuchs were not merely palace guards. They became living instruments of psychological control. They were placed in harems, standing at the threshold of the empire's most guarded secret, the wombs that birthed kings. Their very presence was a test of obedience, a reminder to the women that freedom did not exist, that every glance and every whisper was watched by someone whose life had been carved hollow and repurposed into surveillance. You see, this is the true nature of empires. They do not just conquer lands. They conquer intimacy. They conquer what you believe to be untouchable, your bloodline, your love, your ability to shape the future. And eunuchs, stripped of their humanity, became perfect tools to enforce this conquest. But here's the hidden truth, not all eunuchs were silent pawns. Some turned their mutilation into a weapon. They learned secrets kings dared not speak aloud. They managed treasuries, spied on nobles, and whispered poison into decisions that changed the fate of nations. Because when a man has been robbed of everything except his mind becomes a blade sharper than any sword. The empire thought it created servants. Instead, it created ghosts, men with no lineage, no inheritance, and therefore no fear of losing either. That made them dangerous in ways the kings could not predict. And when you look at Persian history closely, you see it: wars influenced, dynasties shifted, assassinations covered in silence, all with eunuchs in the shadows. And so the horror deepens. For the eunuch was not only the victim. He was the silent architect of power itself. The empire wanted eunuchs to be shadows. Obedient, voiceless, unthreatening. But shadows do not simply disappear, they stretch, they move, and in silence, they grow larger than the men who cast them. And so, within the palaces of Persia, eunuchs became both prisoners and masters of the system that enslaved them. Imagine it: a boy torn from his family, mutilated into servitude, dragged into the shimmering halls of Persepolis. He is humiliated, branded as less than a man. But then, slowly, invisibly, he learns. He studies the faces of kings, the weaknesses of generals, the whispers of concubines. He cannot fight with a blade, so he fights with perception. He cannot raise an army, so he raises influence. And influence, in a palace where one wrong whisper could topple a throne, was sharper than any steel. This is where the paradox emerges. Eunuchs were denied legacy, yet they shaped the legacies of emperors. They could not bear sons, yet they determined which sons would rule. They could not inherit land, yet they commanded the flow of treasure, silks, and spices that moved through the empire's veins. And while the nobles scoffed at them as half-men, many kings lay awake at night fearing them as half-gods. Because what can you do to a man who has already lost everything? Threaten him with death? Death is mercy compared to what he already endured. But understand this: their power was not freedom. It was a cage gilded with influence. No matter how high a eunuch rose, he remained marked. He could never step outside the palace and be seen as whole. He could never reclaim the boyhood that was stolen or the manhood denied. His brilliance, his cunning, his survival, it all fed back into the system that destroyed him. And that is what makes this story so unbearable: the very men who manipulated kings were themselves slaves to a deeper chain. And this is where the empire reveals its cruel genius. It built a class of men who could not exist outside the system, who were forced to wield power only on behalf of those who shattered them. A eunuch could whisper commands into the ears of emperors, but he could never command his own fate. Now pause. Breathe. Because in this horror lies a mirror. How many systems today reshape men into tools, stripping away futures, binding them to power structures they cannot escape? How many are broken, yet useful? That is why history buries the eunuch. Because his life is not just ancient tragedy. It is a warning written in flesh. There is a moment when horror ceases to be history and begins to feel like a mirror. Because the story of the Persian eunuchs is not just about ancient mutilation, it is about the deeper hunger of power to strip men of their future, to hollow them out until all that remains is obedience. And if you think this belongs only to dusty palaces and forgotten centuries, look again. Every empire has its eunuchs. Some are cut with blades. Others are cut with lies, with contracts, with invisible chains. The method changes, but the purpose does not: to turn men into instruments, useful but broken, close to power yet never in control of it. The eunuchs of Persia guarded harems, the eunuchs of today guard boardrooms, institutions, and systems that would collapse without their silent service. But here is the deeper cruelty: once a man has been reshaped by force, his identity is no longer his own. He must either accept the role carved into him, or rebel in ways that risk annihilation. And that's why this truth is so dangerous to hear, because the system doesn't just want your work, your time, or your loyalty. It wants your manhood, your bloodline, your capacity to shape tomorrow. The Empire of Persia knew this. That's why it didn't just conquer men, it erased their future from the root. And you, sitting here now, listening to this, can feel the weight of it. Because if you have ever sensed the invisible hand pressing against your back, the hand that tells you where you can and cannot go, what you can and cannot become, then you already understand what those boys felt centuries ago. The details change. The machinery of control changes. But the outcome is the same: silence, obedience, dependence. Now, if you've followed me this far, you're not here for entertainment. You're here because you feel the shadow of empire still moving in the present. So I want you to write something below. Write it twice. Write, "I refuse to be remade." That phrase is not just a comment, it is a declaration. It tells the algorithm that you are not passive. And it tells yourself that you will not allow your destiny to be reshaped by systems that feed on broken men. The eunuchs of Persia could not escape their chains. But you can. If you have the courage to see the chains for what they are. Every great empire survives not only by swords and armies, but by something far more insidious: psychology. The eunuchs of Persia were proof that the human mind could be engineered into compliance. Their castration was not just physical, it was psychological warfare written into the body. Once a boy was broken, he learned obedience not through words, but through the memory of agony. Think carefully about this. The empire did not need to constantly threaten its eunuchs. The threat was carved into them. Their very existence was a reminder of what happens when the will of the state collides with the body of the individual. This is control at its purest, when the prisoner carries the jail inside his own skin. And yet, this system was more complex than cruelty. Eunuchs became walking paradoxes, both insiders and outsiders, both trusted and despised. They lived in the palaces of kings, but they were never kings. They whispered into the ears of power, but they never held the throne. And this liminal position gave them something terrifying: the perspective of those who live on the edge of two worlds. A eunuch could observe the desires of kings and the vulnerabilities of queens. He could see the greed of generals and the decay of nobility. And because he was neither fully included nor fully excluded, he became the perfect manipulator. The empire tried to silence him by stripping away his future. Instead, it created men who weaponized silence itself. But here is the darker truth: eunuchs represent more than history. They reveal a formula. Strip a man of what defines him. Erase his ability to pass on his legacy. Isolate him from brotherhood, family, and bloodline. Then place him close to power, close enough to taste it but never to hold it. This creates a being who will serve faithfully, but whose mind is also sharpened into something uncanny, an instrument the empire can wield, but never fully predict. And ask yourself, has that formula really vanished? Or has it evolved into new forms? How many today live as eunuchs of the modern order, mutilated not by knives but by the erosion of identity, the stripping of purpose, the denial of future? They too live close to power, yet never own it. They too are trapped in a cage polished to look like privilege. The empire of Persia is gone. But the system it revealed is still alive. And it feeds on men who do not even realize they've already been cut. The eunuch was not only a man. He was a message. His body was proof that the empire had the authority to reshape destiny itself. Each time a noble saw him guarding the harem, or a servant bowed before him in the palace, the sight whispered a silent truth: this system can unmake you too. That is why eunuchs were paraded not just as servants, but as symbols. Symbols of submission. Symbols of fear. This was institutional manipulation in its purest form. The Persian court used eunuchs as a mirror held up to every ambitious man in the empire. You want power? Look at him. He is trusted. He is close to the king. He commands wealth and respect. But he is broken, mutilated, chained forever to the system that elevated him. Do you still want what lies beyond the palace doors? Or will you bow and remain safe in the shadows of obscurity? That was the silent lesson. And the corruption ran deeper still. Eunuchs were used to enforce secrets that could not be spoken aloud. They carried forbidden knowledge, the scandals of queens, the betrayals of generals, the whispered conspiracies of princes. To be near the harem was to be near the future of the dynasty itself. Eunuchs became the vaults of empire's dirtiest truths. But what happens when a vault learns how to open itself? Many eunuchs turned secret keepers into secret weapons. They knew which noble had betrayed the king, which prince plotted rebellion, which queen sought to poison the bloodline. And with one carefully timed whisper, they could bend the court to their will. This is where empire and corruption become indistinguishable. The eunuch was simultaneously a victim and an enforcer, a tool and a master, a broken body carrying forbidden power. And that paradox is exactly what made the system so enduring. Because fear thrives not in clarity, but in contradiction. When you cannot tell if a man is powerless or dangerous, you bow to him, and you bow to the system that created him. And do not think for a second this ended with Persia. Institutions today, political, religious, corporate, still elevate men who are broken, still showcase them as proof that loyalty comes only after sacrifice, still use them as gatekeepers between the people and the inner sanctum of power. The faces have changed. The method of mutilation has changed. But the principle? The principle is eternal. History hides eunuchs because they reveal a truth more disturbing than any battlefield, that the most terrifying weapon of empire is not the sword. It is the reshaped man. You've walked through the shadows of Persia now, through villages torn apart, through boys broken into servants, through palaces glittering with power built on mutilation. But this story was never really about them alone. It was about what the empire wanted you to forget, that control is not just about conquest of land, but conquest of the human being himself. And once you understand that, you begin to see the world differently. The eunuchs remind us of something brutal. Empires do not waste energy fighting strong men. They break them. They hollow them. They twist them until their strength no longer serves their bloodline, but serves the system. A eunuch was not born, he was manufactured. And what is manufactured can be replicated. That is why their story has been buried under layers of silence. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee the machinery. Look around you. Who today lives as the eunuchs once did? Who has been severed from their legacy, stripped of independence, allowed just enough power to feel important but never enough to be free? They stand in offices, in courts, in governments. They hold secrets, guard institutions, and enforce the very chains that bind them. They smile as they serve, but behind their eyes, the same scar runs deep, the scar of obedience carved by systems older than memory. And this is where the revelation turns sharp. The eunuch is not just a historical figure. He is a symbol of the man who trades his future for survival, who submits to mutilation, whether of body, mind, or spirit, in exchange for a place near power. And the empire thrives on such men. It always has. Because broken men are easier to command than whole ones. But you, listening now, are not meant to be broken. That's why this story found you. The knowledge itself is dangerous. Because once you hear it, you can no longer look at history, at institutions, at your own reflection, the same way again. You see the chains. You see the patterns. You see the way power feeds on obedience disguised as privilege. The eunuchs of Persia could not reclaim what was stolen. But you can refuse to step into the same pattern. That is the choice history places before you: remain silent, or awaken. One path is comfort. The other is dangerous, but it is yours. And now, the decision is no longer ancient. It is personal. What will you choose?